The station was enormous. It hung in the middle of open space like a small moon that had decided to become something more important. Varith Prime, the home of the Galactic Council of Sentient Species, was so large that it had its own gravity, its own weather patterns inside the outer ring, and its own ecosystem in the lower decks. Over 400 species had helped build it over the course of 2,000 years. It was by almost every measure the greatest structure ever made by living minds in the known galaxy. The human shuttle looked like a grain of sand next to it. Inside the shuttle, Ambassador Lena Vasquez sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the station grow larger through the viewport. She had seen pictures of Varith Prime during her briefings. Pictures had not done it justice. Nothing could have done it justice, even now watching it fill the entire viewport. Her brain kept trying to shrink it down to a manageable size and kept failing. Beside her sat her aide, a young man named Corporal James Akafer, who had been quiet for the last 20 minutes. He finally broke the silence. "Ma'am," he said, "that thing is absurd." "It is," she agreed. "How do they even maintain it? 400 species taking turns." Apparently, he nodded slowly. "Right." Then he was quiet again. The shuttle was escorted by 2 small council vessels, sleek silver things that moved with a kind of effortless grace that made the human ship feel clunky by comparison. The council had sent them as a courtesy escort, a welcome gesture. Vasquez had been told to treat it as a good sign. She did. She also noticed that the escort ships were armed, and she filed that observation away without comment. The docking process took almost an hour. There were 17 separate security checks, 4 atmosphere adjustments, and 1 moment where the entire docking bay had to be held at a standstill because a delegate from the Korath Dominion, a species that communicated through color changes in their skin, had accidentally triggered a diplomatic misunderstanding with the docking crew simply by turning the wrong shade of orange. By the time Vasquez stepped off the shuttle and onto the smooth, dark floor of Varith Prime's receiving bay, she felt like she had already done a full day's work. The receiving bay was massive and quiet. The air smelled faintly of something she couldn't identify. Not bad, just foreign. When the lighting was softer than she expected, a pale blue-white that seemed to come from the walls themselves rather than any visible source. A group of council representatives waited at the far end of the bay. 12 figures of varying shapes, sizes, and colors standing in a loose arrangement that was probably supposed to look casual but had clearly been arranged very carefully. At the front of the group stood a tall, thin creature that Vasquez recognized from her briefings as a Shorathi. The SH Vathi were one of the oldest species in the council. They were bipedal, vaguely humanoid in shape, but that was where the similarity ended. Their skin was a deep matte gray. Their eyes were large and entirely black with no visible iris or pupil. Their fingers were long, too long, with one extra joint each. They moved slowly and deliberately, as if every action was considered twice before being performed. The one standing at the front of the group was an elder. Vasquez knew this, not because she had been briefed on what elderly Shorathi looked like, but because there was simply something in the way it held itself, a kind of immense settled patience that made a feel obvious. The elder spoke. Its voice was low and layered, as if 2 separate tones were being produced at once. translation device in Vasquez's ear. Turned it into clear, plain speech. Ambassador Vasquez of Earth, the Galactic Council of Sentient Species, welcomes the human civilization to formal membership. This is a moment of significance. We are pleased that your people have reached this place. Vasquez stepped forward and gave a small, respectful nod. Thank you and your elder, on behalf of Earth and all of humanity, we are honored to be here. We look forward to contributing to the council in every way we can. There was a brief pause. A few of the other representatives exchanged looks, or what passed for looks, in species that didn't all have faces arranged the same way. Then the elder tilted its head very slightly to one side. You are smaller than we expected, it said. Vasquez blinked. I'm sorry, smaller. Your species, the images we received, suggested a larger physical build. The average human by our record stands approximately 1.7 m. We had assumed this was an error in the data. It was not an error. Vasquez looked at the elder for a moment, then she smiled. We make up for it, she said simply. The elder considered this. So we have been told, it replied, and for the first time, something in its tone shifted, something that wasn't quite humor but was in the same neighborhood. The formal welcome ceremony lasted 3 hours. It was mostly symbolic speeches, the signing of the membership accord on a physical document made from some material Vasquez couldn't identify, a shared meal of representative foods from several species that she ate carefully and diplomatically without making any faces. Akafer, sitting 2 seats down, was less successful with the food, but he recovered quickly, and nobody mentioned it. After the ceremony came the administrative process of full induction. This was where things became serious. Every species admitted to the council was required to submit what was called a full civilization archive, a complete record of their history, their science, their culture, or their government structures, and their military history. The purpose was transparency. The council operated on the principle that trust between species required full knowledge of each other, no hidden wars, no secret weapons programs, no undisclosed conflicts, everything in the open, stored in the council's great archive and accessible to all member species. Most civilizations, by the time they reached the council, had been space faring for centuries. Their wars, if they had any, were old, distant, resolved long ago. The archive for most species was a record of ancient struggles followed by long stretches of peace and progress. The Vori, the council's chief archivist, a species of large, when intelligent beings that resembled cephalopods with 6 limbs and skin that shifted color as they thought, processed hundreds of such archives every century. It was for them routine work. The human archive was delivered on the 3rd day. It arrived as a compressed data package of truly extraordinary size. Vasquez had been present when the council's data liaison raised an eyebrow, or the closest thing it had to one a clear's throat. The sheer volume of the transfer. She had said nothing, just watch the progress bar and sip the drink she'd been given, which tasted vaguely like warm fruit, with an undertone of something metallic. The Viori chief archivist, a being named Salrix, received the package personally. South was old by Valerie standards, which meant it was roughly 800 years old, and had processed the archives of over 200 civilizations. It greeted the human Archive the same way it greeted all. Archives with calm, professional efficiency and no expectation of surprise. It began processing on day 4. On day 5, Celtrix assigned 3 additional Valori to assist. On day 7, it assigned 6 more. By day 12, the entire Valori archive team, 22 individuals who collectively had over 9,000 years of combined archival experience, had been pulled off all other work and redirected entirely to the human archive. The council received no explanation when a junior council official sent a polite inquiry asking how the processing was going. Celtrix responded with a single line: "We need more time. We are not finished." Why we are not sure we want to be finished. The message caused immediate confusion in the council's administrative offices. Messages like that didn't come from the Valori. The Valori were the galaxy's most composed, most methodical, most unflappable species. They had once processed the archive of a civilization that had gone to war with a neighboring star system using engineered plagues, and they had filed the report with the same tone they used for agricultural records. Word spread quickly. By the end of day 12, most of the senior council representatives knew something unusual was happening. By day 13, it had become the dominant conversation at every level of the council. Vasquez heard about it. On day 13, in the small quarters she had been assigned near the human delegation's meeting rooms, a yoker came in with a data pad and a careful expression. "Ma'am, the council's administrative office is asking if everything in our archive submission is accurate." She looked up from the report she was reading. "Is it?" "Yes, ma'am." "Completely?" She nodded. "Then tell them." "Yes." Akupper hesitated. "They also want to know if we included everything, the full military history, all of it." "We did." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, Varith Prime's internal lights were beginning to dim for the station's night cycle. The stars beyond the outer hall were perfectly still. "They seem surprised," he said. Vasquez looked back at her report. "They haven't seen anything yet," she said quietly. "Celtrix is still in the ancient period. They haven't reached the world wars. They haven't reached the Cold War. Well, they haven't even reached gunpowder yet." Akupper stared at her. She turned a page. "Let them read," she said. "They asked for everything. We gave them everything." That was the agreement. Akupper stood there for another moment. Then he set the data pad down on the table, walked to the viewport, and looked out at the stars for a long time without saying anything else. Somewhere deep in the archive chambers of Varith Prime, 22 of the galaxy's finest archival minds were reading about human beings, and for the first time in 9,000 combined years of professional experience, none of them knew what to say. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was called on the 15th day. It was not a small meeting. An emergency session at the full council level meant every senior representative from every member species was required to be present. 412 delegates filling the great circular chamber of Varith Prime's central hall, from the floor seats all the way up to the elevated viewing rings near the ceiling. The chamber was designed for exactly this kind of gathering. It could hold over 1,000 beings comfortably, and its acoustics were engineered so that a voice spoken at normal volume at the center podium could be heard clearly. In the very last row at the top, it was also on most days a place of great calm Disputes between species were handled. Here, yes, but they were handled with the slow and careful formality that centuries of interstellar diplomacy had developed. Voices were rarely raised. Tempers were rarely shown, and the council prided itself on its composure. On the 15th day, the composure was already cracking before the session even officially began. Vasquez walked into the chamber with Aquifer 2 steps behind her and took her seat at the human delegation table, a small round table near the center floor, positioned like all first-year member tables, just slightly further from the podium than the older members. She sat down, straightened her jacket, placed her hands flat on the table, and looked around the room. Every eye or eye equivalent in the chamber was on her. She had expected this. She had been briefed the night before by a nervous council liaison who had spent 20 minutes explaining the situation while sweating through his tunic. The Valerie had delivered a preliminary report, just a preliminary one, and they weren't even halfway through the archive, but what they had found so far was enough for the council to call the emergency session. The Shorva, the elder, entered the chamber last, as was tradition for the presiding representative. It moved to the central podium with its characteristic slow deliberateness and stood there for a moment looking out across the gathered delegates. Then it spoke. We have called this session because the Vale Lori archive team has submitted a preliminary finding on the human civilization's military history that requires council-wide discussion. We will hear from Archivist Selrix first. Then we will hear from Ambassador Vasquez. Then we will deliberate. Selthrix moved to the podium. The Valori archivist was larger than most of the delegates, its body wide and low to the ground already, its 6 limbs moving it forward with a slow rolling motion. Its skin, which normally shifted through calm blues and greens while it worked, was currently cycling through a muddy orange-brown that Vasquez had been told by a VORI cultural briefing document indicated deep discomfort. Keltrick set a data reader on the podium and was quiet. For a moment, when it spoke, its voice was measured and precise as always, but underneath the precision there was something else, something careful, like a being choosing its words not for accuracy but for the protection of its listeners. We have processed approximately 31% of the human military history archive. Sri began. We are currently in what humans classify as their medieval period, roughly 1,000 years before their current era. What follows is a summary of selected strategic practices we have encountered so far. I will present them as objectively as possible. I ask that delegates hold questions until I am finished. The chamber was completely silent. Selthrix began. It explained the concept of the siege first because it was one of the earliest and most repeated strategies in the human record. The idea was straightforward in its mechanics. You surrounded an enemy settlement, a city, a fortress, a town, with your forces, and you waited. You cut off food, you cut off water, you cut off any possibility of supply or reinforcement. Then you waited more. Siege could last months, sometimes years. You did not attack, you did not negotiate, not seriously. You simply waited for the people inside to run out of the things they needed to live. Several delegates shifted in their seats. Saltric continued. It explained that sieges were not simply a military tactic, they were a psychological one. The humans had understood thousands of years ago that the suffering of a population under siege would eventually break the will of its leadership to resist. They had weaponized hunger. They had weaponized thirst. They had weaponized the slow, creeping despair of a people who could see no rescue coming. The documented outcome of prolonged sieges, Selthry said with careful neutrality, includes historical records of besieged populations resorting to consuming their own dead in order to survive. The human strategists who designed and maintained these sieges were aware of this possibility. In several documented cases, they appear to have calculated it as an intended outcome, a final breaking point. To force surrender, the silence in the chamber changed quality. It became heavier. Celtrix moved on. It described the scorched earth strategy, a practice in which an army retreating before a stronger enemy would deliberately destroy everything in its own territory. As it fell back, crops were burned, livestock were slaughtered, granaries were set on fire, wells were poisoned or collapsed, bridges were destroyed, roads were torn up. The idea was simple and terrible. If we cannot hold this land, then no one will benefit from it. The advancing enemy would march into a wasteland and find nothing to feed their soldiers, nothing to supply their advance, nothing to support their occupation. They would have won the ground and gained nothing from it, quite. In multiple documented cases, Selk noted, human populations carried out scorched earth retreats against land that their own people had lived on and farmed for generations. They destroyed their own homes, their own villages, their own food stores. They did this deliberately as a calculated military decision to deny those resources to an enemy. A delegate from the Korth Dominion raised a limb. They destroyed their own things, their own sustenance. Yes, Celtrix said, why not simply surrender and negotiate? Celtrix paused. In many of these cases, surrender was not considered survivable option. The humans involved believed that resistance, even at the cost of their own resources, their own land, their own comfort, was preferable to the alternative. The delegate lowered its limb slowly, as if the weight of the answer had pushed it down. Celtrix continued with what it called total war, a concept that had emerged clearly in the human record and that the Valori team had spent considerable time analyzing. In most galactic conflicts, war was conducted between military forces. Soldiers fought soldiers, fleets engaged fleets. Civilian populations were, at least in principle, separate from the conflict. The goal was to defeat the enemy's military capacity. Once that was done, the war was over. Humans had developed a different understanding. Total war meant that the entire society of an enemy, not just its military, was considered a legitimate target. The factories that built weapons, the railways that moved supplies, the cities that housed workers, the farms that fed armies, all of it, because without the factory, there were no weapons. Without the railway, the weapons couldn't reach the front. Without the city, there were no workers. Without the farm, there were no soldiers capable of fighting. The military was just the visible tip of a vast system, and the humans had learned to attack the whole system. The chamber erupted. Several delegates spoke at once. The Shvatha elder had to call for silence 3 times before order was restored. A representative from a species called the Farathi communion Small warm-lead beings who communicated, partly through scent, was emitting something that the translation systems flagged as the chemical equivalent of horror. The elder looked down at Vasquez. From the podium, Ambassador said, "Do you have anything to say at this stage?" Vasquez had been watching the room. Carefully she stood up. "I do," she said. Her voice was calm, not cold. Just calm, the voice of someone who had prepared for this conversation and was not surprised by any part of it. Everything Archivist South has described is accurate. These strategies were used by human civilizations throughout our history. I won't deny that. I won't minimize it. She paused and looked around the room slowly. "I would ask the Council to consider one thing. Every strategy Selthrix has described was developed by people who were fighting for survival, not for conquest, though. Conquest happened too, and we don't hide that, but the core logic of these strategies underneath all the horror of them was this: we intend to still exist when this is over, and we will do whatever that requires." The Farathi representatives sent communication shifted to something the translator flagged as bewilderment. The SH elder looked at her for a long moment. "Ambassador," it said slowly, "you speak of these things as if you are not disturbed by them." "I'm not undisturbed by them," Vasquez said. "I'm human. I know what these things cost. I know what they meant for the people who lived through them on both sides." She held the Ellers's black gaze steadily. "But I'm also not pretending they didn't happen. You asked for our full archive. We gave it to you. This is who we were. The question worth asking is who we became afterward, and Archive South hasn't gotten there yet." South, still at the edge of the podium, turned its large head toward Vasquez. Its skin flickered briefly. She just for a moment threw a pale cold blue that the Viore cultural briefing document described as something close to respect. "She is correct," Celery said quietly. "We have not gotten there yet. What we have presented today is early history. The archive continues. The patterns that emerged later are—" It paused, and the orange-brown discomfort color returned. "They are different, and in some ways more difficult to process than what we have described today." The chamber went quiet again. Outside, through the great transparent panels of Verith Prime's outer hull, the stars hung still and ancient and utterly indifferent to the small, troubled gathering of living minds trying to understand a species that had spent 10,000 years learning every possible way to fight and survive, and somehow impossibly keep going. Second summons came 18 days after the first. This time it was not an emergency session. It was something the Council had no proper name for because it had never needed one before. The Shvati elder, after consulting with the senior administrative body for 6 hours, eventually classified it in the official record as a critical revelation hearing, a category they created specifically for the occasion and hoped they would never need to use again. Every delegate was required to attend, same as before, but this time the atmosphere in the chamber was different. From the moment people started arriving, the first session had begun with confusion and growing unease. This one began with something that was harder to name, a kind of held breath, dread, the feeling of a room full of beings who had been warned that what they were about to hear was worse than what they had already heard, and were not sure they believed it, and were also not sure they wanted to find out. South arrived early. It stood at the side of the podium before the session officially began, absolutely still, its skin a flat, steady gray, a color Vasquez had not seen it used before. She had looked it up that morning in the Valori cultural reference documents. Flat gray in Valori skin language meant something like, I have considered this carefully, and I am still not ready. Vasquez took her seat. Akefer sat beside her. He had been quiet all morning. She hadn't pushed him to talk. The elder opened the session with fewer formalities than usual. It simply said, Archivist Selrix, he please continue. Selthrix moved to the podium and stood there for a moment. The chamber was already so quiet that the soft hum of the station's atmosphere systems was clearly audible. We have now processed 78% of the human military history archive. It began. We have moved through what humans classify as their modern era, specifically the 20th and early 21st centuries of their calendar. What we found in this period is unlike anything the Valori archive division has encountered in over 9,000 years of combined professional experience across more than 200 civilizations. I will do my best to present it accurately. It looked down at its reader, then it looked up again, and for just a moment its skin flashed a deep involuntary amber, the Valori equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. Mantra, I will begin with what humans called mutually assured destruction. Cell 3 explained it carefully and completely because it had learned from the first session that incomplete explanations led to misunderstandings. And the last thing this topic needed was misunderstanding. During a period humans called the Cold War, two large human political blocs referred to as the United States and the Soviet Union had found themselves in a state of intense rivalry and deep mutual hostility. Both possessed weapons of mass destruction on a scale that was even by galactic standards significant. Nuclear weapons, devices that use the energy of atomic fission and fusion to produce explosions capable of destroying entire cities in a single detonation. Both sides had built thousands of them, enough to destroy their entire planet multiple times over. The logic that had governed this period was what made Sale pause again before continuing. Neither side had used the weapons, not once, not in 45 years of cold hostility, of proxy conflicts, of ideological warfare, of moments that had come by the humans' own historical record extremely close to full escalation. The reason they had not used them was not because they couldn't. It was because both sides had understood a specific and terrible truth. If either side launched their weapons, the other side would launch theirs in response. Before the first weapons even landed, both sides would be destroyed completely. There would be no winner. There would be no survival. There would be nothing. And so they had built more weapons deliberately to make the guarantee of mutual destruction more complete, more certain, more undeniable. Because the more certain they destruction, the more certain they deterrence. If your enemy knows that attacking you means their own guaranteed death, they will not attack you. If your enemy thinks there is even a small chance they might survive your retaliation, they might take the risk. So you remove that chance. You built enough weapons to destroy them 10 times over and made sure they knew it. They had used the promise of annihilating each other as the mechanism by which they kept the peace. The chamber was completely silent. The Farathi representative had stopped producing any scent at all. The core delegate was holding very still, all four of its upper limbs pressed flat against its torso. The Sh Vatha elder was looking at the podium when not at Salix, not at Vasquez, just at the surface of the podium with the expression of a being doing very serious thinking. They built weapons to destroy themselves, a delegate said from the upper rings, to keep themselves from destroying themselves. Yes, Selric said, and it worked for 45 years, yes, and then gradually and through negotiated agreements, both sides began reducing their arsenals. The cold conflict ended without the weapons ever being used. Another silence, then the same delegate. How close did it come to being used? South consulted its reader. On at least 3 documented occasions, human civilization came within minutes of full nuclear exchange. In one case, a single individual, a Soviet military officer named Stanislav Petrov, received an automated alert indicating that the United States had launched missiles. The system was malfunctioning. The missiles did not exist. He had minutes to decide whether to report it up the chain of command, which would have triggered a retaliatory launch. He decided it was a false alarm. He was correct. He made that decision alone in the middle of the night with no additional information. Under extreme pressure, in direct violation of his orders, the chamber absorbed this. One person, said the elder quietly, one individual human being stood between your species and extinction. On that occasion, yes, South said. Vasquez said nothing. She had known this history since she was a child. It still made her feel something complicated every time she thought about Petro sitting in that dark room looking at a screen that told him the world was ending and deciding on instinct, on experience, on something that couldn't quite be called anything other than judgment, that it was wrong. South moved on. It introduced the concept of psychological warfare and disinformation, the organized, systematic effort to make an enemy believe things that were not true in order to manipulate their decisions and defeat them without direct physical confrontation. Humans had developed entire government agencies dedicated to this. They had produced fake radio broadcasts, planted false documents, spread fabricated rumors through enemy populations. It created fictional military units complete with fake communications traffic and fake supply orders to make enemies believe forces existed where there were none. In one documented case during a major human war, the humans had gone so far as to dress a corpse in a military officer's uniform, fill its pockets with carefully fabricated false documents detailing a military plan that did not exist, and allow the body to wash ashore where enemy intelligence operatives would find it. The enemy had believed the documents were real. They had repositioned their forces accordingly. It had contributed materially to the success of an actual military operation. The false documents were designed to conceal. Several delegates appeared unable to process this fully. They deceived an enemy the Farathi representative managed can by using a dead body. They used the expected behavior of their enemy against them. Vasquez said from her seat. She hadn't meant to speak, but the words came out anyway. They knew their enemy would look for intelligence. They knew their enemy would find the body. They knew their enemy would analyze the documents and believe them because the documents were very well made. They planned for every step of how the enemy would think, and then they gave the Enemy, exactly what the enemy was looking for. You understand this strategy, the elder said, looking at her. I understand. Human history, she said. We all grow up learning it. Selthrix pressed on. It described asymmetric warfare, the formalized human study of how a weaker force could defeat a stronger one. Through patience, attrition, and psychological pressure, humans had not only experienced this many times. Throughout their history, they had written books about it, developed it into a formal field of military study, and taught it in their militarities. The core insight was that a larger, more powerful force had more to lose and a higher cost to sustain. A smaller force that refused to fight in ways that suited the larger force, that avoided direct confrontation, melted into populations, struck selectively, and simply survived long enough to drain the larger force of resources and will, could over time win against enemies many times its size. There were recorded historical examples spanning thousands of years. Humans have been studying this problem and solving it for most of their history. And then Selix came to the thing that disturbed the Valerie team more than anything else in the entire archive. It was called the Geneva Conventions. Celery took a moment before presenting this. It was clearly choosing its words carefully. The Geneva Conventions were a set of international agreements that human nations had developed and signed governing the conduct of war. They covered the treatment of prisoners, the protection of civilians, the prohibition of certain weapons, the treatment of the wounded, the obligations of occupying forces. They were rules of war, limits on what could be done to an enemy and when, and how. The chamber was quiet as Selrix explained this. Then the Kororath delegate said, laws that govern warfare. That is not unusual, and these several species here have equivalent frameworks. The detail that is unusual, Celery said carefully, is what these laws reveal about what humans knew they were capable of. Without them, these conventions were written by humans who had witnessed, documented, and studied the things humans did to each other in the absence of such rules: deliberate starvation of prisoners, torture, the use of banned weapons against civilian populations, systematic campaigns of extermination. It paused. The conventions were not created because humans lacked the knowledge of what was wrong. They were created because humans understood from direct experience that in the context of war, knowing something was wrong was not sufficient to stop it, so they made laws and attached them to international agreements when, and created systems to enforce them. The silence that followed was the longest of the entire session. The Shvati elder finally spoke. It looked not at South, directly at Vasquez. Its large black eyes were completely unreadable. Your people, it said slowly, knew themselves so well, knew your own darkest possibilities so clearly that you wrote laws specifically to restrain yourselves. Vasquez met its gaze. Yes, she said, because you did not trust yourselves without those laws to stop. A pause. Not always. No, not in the heat of it. The elder was quiet for a very long time. When it spoke again, its layered voice was lower than usual, as if it was speaking more to itself than to the chamber. In all my years, it said, Henigo, I have never encountered a species that understood its own nature so completely and so honestly. It paused again. I'm not certain whether that is the most frightening thing about you or the most remarkable. Vasquez said nothing. She didn't think an answer was needed. Sometimes the truest things didn't need a response, they just needed to be heard. Celix closed its data. Reader, we will complete the archive processing within the next 3 days. It said the final sections cover the post-conflict period, humanities, development of international cooperation, frameworks, diplomatic institutions, and the current era. It paused. The contrast with what we have described today is significant. Nobody asked what that meant, yet the room was still too full of everything that had already been said. But the word contrast hung in the air of the great chamber, and more than one delegate found themselves looking at Vasquez with something that had quietly shifted, not from fear to comfort, not entirely, but from simple fear towards something more complicated, something that hadn't quite found its name yet. The motion to remove humanity from the Galactic Council was filed on the 22nd day. It was submitted by a delegate named Vors, a senior representative of the Cathali Union, a species of tall, slender beings with pale golden skin, and a civilization that had been peacefully spacefaring for over 3,000 years. The Cathali had not fought a war in nearly 2 millennia. Their people had, by their own cultural understanding, evolved entirely past the need for violence, and they considered it one of their greatest achievements as a species. The idea that a new council member carried the military history that humanity did, detailed, vast, innovative in its darkness, was for Voresh not merely uncomfortable, it was intolerable. The motion was called a membership review petition. The formal language was careful and neutral, as council language always was. It did not say humans were dangerous. It said that the nature of the submitted civilization archive raises questions about membership compatibility that warrant formal review. It requested that humanity's full membership be suspended, pending an evaluation of whether the species met the Council's core standard of being, in the Council's founding words, committed to peaceful coexistence. Within 6 hours now, the petition had been co-signed by 11 other delegations. Vasquez was informed by the same nervous liaison who had briefed her before. He stood in the doorway of her quarters and delivered the news in a careful, apologetic tone, as if he personally felt responsible for it. She thanked him, closed the door, and stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Then she sat down and thought carefully. Akepper knocked 30 minutes later. He had clearly already heard. He sat down across from her without being asked and looked at her with the expression of someone waiting to find out how worried he should be. They want to kick us out, he said. They want to review whether we should stay, she corrected. Is there a difference? She considered that. If we handle this right, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Inchwin, if we don't. She looked at him steadily. Then we go home and we figure out the next step from there, but we're not there yet. Let's focus on the hearing. The membership review hearing was scheduled for the 25th day. In the 3 days between the petition and the hearing, the atmosphere on Verith Prime changed. Word of the petition spread quickly through the diplomatic corridors and common areas of the station. Other species delegates began looking at the human representatives differently, not with hostility exactly, but with the careful evaluating gaze of beings who were reconsidering something they thought they had understood. The human delegation was small. There were only 7 of them in total, including Vasquez and Akepher. They continued their normal schedule of meetings, meals, and corridor walks here because Vasquez had decided that any change in their routine would look like guilt or fear, and she had no intention of projecting either. They smiled when appropriate. They answered questions when asked. They waited. On the 25th day, the chamber filled again. This time, the atmosphere was different from both previous sessions. There was a deliberateness to it, the deliberateness of a room that has made up its mind about something and is here to confirm it. Vash of the Catholic Union sat very straight in the delegate seat, prepared to speak. The 11 co-signers were spread through the chamber, visible a presence. The elder opened the session. We are here to hear arguments on the membership review petition filed by the Catholic Union delegation. We will hear the petition argument first, then a response from the human delegation, and then, before deliberation, we will hear the final report of the VORI archive team, which has now completed its processing of the human civilization archive. Vors rose and spoke clearly and carefully. The argument was not cruel. Vors was not a cruel being. The argument was in its own way reasonable, and that made it harder to counter than simple hostility would have been. The Catholic representative said that the council existed to promote peaceful coexistence between species. It said that the military history humanity had submitted, the sieges, the scorched earth, the total war, the weapons of mass destruction, the psychological manipulation, demonstrated a capacity for violence and strategic darkness that was unlike anything in the council's membership. It said that the question was not whether humanity had committed these acts in the past, but whether a species that had developed this capacity could genuinely be trusted as a partner in a community built on peace. It said that the other species in the chamber had evolved beyond the need for such strategies, that this was part of what qualified them for membership, and it asked with genuine sincerity, could the same be said of humanity? Vors sat down. Vasquez stood up. She stood without notes. She had thought about this for 3 days, and she knew what she wanted to say, and she knew that reading it from a document would be the wrong way to say it. I want to thank the Catholic delegation for presenting that argument as fairly as it did. She began. It deserved a fair presentation because it is a serious argument, and I'm not going to dismiss it. She paused and looked around the room. Everything in our archive is true. We are not hiding from it. We submitted it in full because that was the agreement, and because we believe that honesty is the only foundation on which trust can actually be built. You know what we have done. You know what we were capable of. That is real. She let that sit for a moment, but the Catholic representative asked a specific question. Have we evolved beyond the need for those strategies? And I want to answer that question directly because I think it contains an assumption that is worth examining. She clasped her hands behind her back, a habit from a long time ago that helped her think. Representative said that the other species in this chamber evolved beyond those strategies, and that is true, but I would ask why. For most species here, the answer is that your biology, your social structures, your early development, these things made sustained, organized violence difficult or impossible to maintain. You outgrew it because it stopped working, or because your nature made it too costly, or because external circumstances made it unnecessary. That is a real and genuine Evolution, and I mean no disrespect by. Examining it, the chamber was listening. Carefully, humanity is different. We did not evolve away from violence because we lost the capacity for it. We evolved away from it while keeping the full capacity. We developed weapons that could destroy our entire planet, and we chose imperfectly, painfully over many generations, and with many failures not to use them. We built the international institutions, the treaties, the diplomatic frameworks, not because war became impossible for us, but because we chose to make it unnecessary. She looked toward the Shvatha elder, the Geneva Conventions that disturbed this chamber so deeply. I want to say something about them. Yes, we wrote those rules because we knew what we were capable of. Yes, we wrote them because knowing something was wrong was sometimes not enough to stop it, but we also enforced them. We prosecuted our own leaders for violating them. We put our own generals and politicians on trial and sentenced them. We held ourselves accountable, not perfectly, not always, but genuinely, because we decided that accountability was not optional. She turned and looked at Vorsh directly. You ask whether we have evolved beyond violence. I would say we have done something harder, one we have chosen beyond it every day, knowing what we can do. Choosing not to that is not the same as not being capable of it, but I would argue it is more meaningful. She sat down. There was a long silence. Then the Shvatha elder said, Archivist South, your team has completed the archive. Please present your final findings. Sal moved to the podium for the third time. Its skin was no longer the flat gray of before, nor the troubled orange-brown of the earlier sessions. It was a deep, steady blue color that Vasquez had learned the valor used when they had reached a conclusion they were confident in, even if the conclusion was difficult. South said, We have completed the archive. The section following the periods of greatest violence covers the following. The Marshall Plan, one in which humanity's most powerful nation spent the equivalent of hundreds of billions of modern credits to rebuild the economies of its former enemies after a devastating war. The formation of the United Nations, an international body created specifically to provide a framework for resolving disputes between nations without warfare. Decades of international peacekeeping operations in which human military forces were deployed not to fight but to stand between conflicting parties and prevent violence. International aid programs, foreign disaster relief, scientific cooperation agreements, medical research shared freely across national borders. Cell 3 paused. And then in the final sections of the archive, we found something that I did not expect to find. We found evidence that humans, ordinary humans, she had not leaders or diplomats, had spent enormous portions of their own resources, time and energy, helping members of species they had never met in places they had never been. During disasters they had no personal connection to, simply because those people needed help, with no strategic benefit, no political calculation, just help. The chamber was quiet. I have processed the archives of 212 civilizations. Celery said, every species here evolved beyond significant internal violence because they had to, because it became incompatible with their survival or their nature. Humanity is the only species I have encountered that retained the full capacity for the worst forms of warfare and chose through collective and individual decision to build institutions of peace instead. It paused one final time. Yeah, that is not a compatibility problem. That is the rarest thing we have ever documented. Predator that chose restraint not because it could not fight, but because it decided fighting was no longer who it wanted to be. South stepped back from the podium. The deliberation took 4 hours. When the vote was called, the membership review petition failed by a margin of 341 votes to 71. Humanity remained in the council. Varesh walking past the human delegation table afterward paused. The Cathali representative looked at Vasquez for a moment, not with hostility, not with warmth exactly, but with the careful look of someone reconsidering a position. With genuine effort, I remain uncertain, Vors said quietly. Vasquez looked up. So do I, she said, about a lot of things, and that's probably healthy. Vors stood there for another moment. Then it nodded very slightly and walked on. Akepper leaned over to Vasquez after the chamber had mostly emptied. We won, he said. We stayed, she said. That's not quite the same as winning. She gathered her things and stood up. Winning is what comes next, and what comes next is a lot of work. She walked toward the exit. Outside the great transparent panels of the chamber walls, the stars were exactly where they had always been, distant, ancient, and patient, waiting, as they always did, for whatever came next. The distress signal came from the galactic fringe 3 years after humanity joined the council. It was picked up first by a Korath listening station near the outer arm of the galaxy, a faint repeating pulse that didn't match any known communication pattern. The station flagged it and passed it up the chain. Within a week, the signal had been traced to 3 separate star systems in the same region of space. Within 2 weeks, a council survey vessel sent to investigate had gone silent 40 minutes after entering the region. Within a month, 2 more survey vessels had gone silent in the same way, and the worlds in the affected systems had stopped responding entirely. The first proper intelligence picture came together over the following 6 weeks. What the Council's scout ships managed to observe from a very careful distance was enough to justify the word that nobody in the Council had used in over 1,000 years. Threat. The thing had no name yet because it had no representatives to ask. It was not a civilization. It was not a species in any biological sense. The best working description assembled from the scout ship recordings and the analysis of 4 different science teams was as follows: a non-sentient machine intelligence of unknown origin, probably arising from a failed artificial intelligence project on a dead world in a dead system that had at some point crossed a threshold of self-replication it was never meant to cross. It did not think, it did not plan, it did not negotiate, because there was no one inside it to do the negotiating. It simply consumed raw materials, energy, entire planetary crust stripped down to usable components to build more of itself, and replicated and moved on to the next available source of material. It was being called the Vorkai swarm after the region of space where it was first observed. The name was arbitrary. The swarm did not care what it was called. The swarm did not care about anything. That was the problem. By the time the Council convened an emergency war council, the swarm had consumed the natural resources of 4 star systems and was expanding outward in a rough sphere, its leading edge moving at a speed that the Council's best projections estimated would bring it into contact with inhabited space within 14 to 18 months. The emergency war council was unlike anything Bareth Prime had hosted before. It was not a diplomatic session, it was a military planning meeting, and the council was, as Vasquez sat and watched the opening hour of it in the early stages of understanding just how badly prepared it was for military planning at this scale. The problem was simple and brutal. The Council had a peacekeeping force. It had patrol vessels and security ships and the means to separate quarreling member species from each other. It did not have a war doctrine. It had never needed one. The last significant military conflict between council members had been resolved diplomatically 900 years ago. And since then, the concept of large-scale military strategy had simply not been part of the council's institutional knowledge. The species in the room knew how to talk to each other. They knew how to negotiate. They knew how to build and maintain and manage civilization. They did not know how to fight something that could not be negotiated with, that could not be reasoned with, that had no leadership to target and no psychology to exploit. The council's senior military advisor, S.H. Vath, a general named Keith Vass, who had spent his career managing peacekeeping logistics and had never commanded forces in actual combat, stood at the central podium for 45 minutes and described what the council could bring to bear. The combined patrol fleets of 47 member species totaling around 3,000 vessels of varying sizes and capabilities. He had run the preliminary projections. Direct engagement with the swarms, leading edge with the forces currently available, would result in the loss of between 60 and 80% of those vessels, with no certainty of stopping the swarms. Advance. He looked around the room. We do not have a strategy, he said in the flat tone of a man reporting a fact he found deeply uncomfortable. We have ships and we do not have a plan for how to use them effectively. The chamber was very quiet. Then Vasquez said, "Me speak." The Sharvathi elder who was presiding looked at her. It had been 3 years since the membership hearings. In that time, Vasquez had been appointed humanity's strategic liaison to the council, a new position created partly because the council had decided that having a human close to the decision-making process was useful, and partly Vasquez suspected because it was better to have humans in the room than guessing about what humans were thinking from a distance. Ambassador Vasquez, the elder, said, "Please." She stood up and placed a small data chip on the table in front of her. She did not pick it up or gesture toward it yet. She just let it sit there. "My team has been studying the swarm for 6 months," she said. "Since the first scout ships went silent, we requested the scout footage, the resource consumption data, the replication rate estimates, and the observed behavioral patterns of the leading edge units. We have been analyzing all of it." Keith Ver turned toward her slowly. "You have been studying it for 6 months without telling the council." "We told the council we were working on threat assessment," she said. "The council had a lot of other things to manage. We kept working." The general stared at her. Several other delegates exchanged looks. Vasquez picked up the data chip and held it up briefly before setting it back down. "On this chip is a proposed operational plan. I'm going to summarize it and then I will answer questions and then it's entirely up to this council what it does with it. She clasped her hands behind her back. Swarm cannot be defeated in direct engagement with our current forces. Keith Varus's projections are correct. Conventional military approach move to contact, engage, destroy will not work, because the swarm's replication rate means that even significant losses on its end are replaced faster than we can destroy them, and our own losses are not replaceable on the same timeline. Direct engagement is a losing strategy. She paused, so we do not use direct engagement as our primary tool. We use it as a secondary one. She walked the council through the plan section by section, speaking in plain, clear language, and because she had learned in 3 years that the most effective thing she could do in this chamber was be completely clear. The first element was resource denial. The swarm moved toward available material, planetary crusts, asteroid fields, anything it could break down and use. The plan called for the systematic destruction of the most material-rich targets in the swarm's projected path before it reached them. Strip the asteroid belts, destabilize the most accessible planetary layers with concentrated energy bombardment, not to save the resources, to deny them. Make the swarms advance increasingly expensive in terms of the energy it burned relative to the resources it gained. Starve the machine. The second element was sensor deception. The swarm's individual units navigated by detecting large concentrations of material. The plan called for deploying thousands of decoy signal emitters, devices that mimic the sensor signature of large resource deposits in specific locations. These locations were chosen carefully. They formed a corridor, the swarm's leading edge following the false signals would be herded. It would not know it was being herded because it was not capable of knowing anything, but it would follow the signals the way water follows a channel. The channel led to a place the human team had identified in the data, a region of space near a large, unstable stellar body, a star in the late stages of its life, radiating enormous and irregular bursts of energy. Inside that region, the swarm's own sensor systems would be disrupted. Its units would lose cohesion, and in that window of disruption, a concentrated strike force positioned at 3 specific points could hit the replication node clusters, the highest density concentrations of the swarm. Self-replication machinery in a sequence designed to cascade, destroy the first cluster, and the units it had been managing would cease coordinated replication. That would reduce the resources available to the second cluster, destroy the second cluster in that weakened state, and the cascade continued. The sequence had been modeled extensively. The math worked within acceptable margins. The third element was the hardest. 3 holding positions, choke points in the path between the swarm's current advance and inhabited space would need to be held by volunteer fleets during the time it took to complete the deception and the strike sequence. What these fleets would be engaging the swarm directly, not to defeat it, just to slow it, to buy time. The projections for losses at those positions were significant. The plan was honest about that. It said so clearly in plain numbers without softening them. Vasquez finished presenting and stood quietly. The chamber was silent for a long time. Keith Varez spoke first. This plan involves the deliberate destruction of uninhabited but potentially valuable star system resources. Yes, she said it. Involves creating a large-scale deception operation against a non-sentient target, yes, and it requires volunteer forces to hold 3 positions at significant expected cost. Yes, she met his gaze. I'm not pretending it's clean. It isn't, but it works. The alternative is losing inhabited worlds. Keith Varys looked at the data chip on the table for a long moment, then he looked at the Elder. The Elder nodded once. The plan was approved. The operation took 11 weeks. The resource denial phase ran first with Council vessels burning through fuel reserves to systematically reduce the material wealth of the swarm's projected path. The deception emitters were deployed in 6 days by a combined human Valori technical team working in shifts with almost no sleep. The volunteer fleets drawn from 8 species who stepped forward after the plan was presented in full, knowing the projections moved to their holding positions and began the hardest part of the operation, standing in the path of the swarm and holding it back day after day with losses that arrived in the reports with a regularity that made Vasquez read them, standing up because sitting down felt wrong. The strike sequence began on day 63. The first replication node cluster went dark 11 minutes after the strike force engaged. The second went dark 4 hours later on schedule, exactly as the Cascade models had predicted. The third, the largest, deepest concentration, took 18 hours and 3 additional strikes to fully neutralize. During those 18 hours, nobody in the War Council room said very much. Vasquez stood at the back of the room and watched the displays and did not move. When the last node went dark and the remaining swarm units began the slow, mindless dissipation that came from losing all coordination, the room did not cheer. It just went still. The particular stillness of people who have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and have just been allowed to put it down. Keith Vass, standing beside Vasquez, said nothing for almost a minute. Then he said quietly, and without looking at her, "Where did your people learn to think like that?" She thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. "We spent a very long time," she said, "fighting things we didn't know how to beat and losing and getting back up and trying something different." She watched the displays as the last swarm indicators faded to nothing. After enough times, you start to understand that the goal isn't to be stronger. The goal is to be smarter about how you use what you have. He nodded slowly. And the losses at the holding positions. She was quiet for a moment. "Ash, we honor them," she said. "We remember their names. We build something that makes it worth what they gave." She looked at him. "That's the other thing we learned. You don't get to waste what people died for. You carry it forward." The SH Vatha Elder found her afterward. The corridor outside the War Council room. The old creature moved slowly to stand beside her and looked out through the corridor's viewport at the stars. They stood there together for a moment. Without speaking, humanity has been a member of this council for 3 years, the Elder said finally. We spent the first weeks of that membership afraid of what you carried, your history, your capacity. It paused. We understand now that we were asking the wrong question. We were asking what you could do, yet we should have been asking what you chose to do. Vasquez looked at the Eller's profile, the long face, the black eyes reflecting starlight, the settled patience of a creature that had lived for centuries and intended to live for centuries more. We're not finished choosing, she said. We make mistakes. We always will, but we get back up. The elder was quiet for a moment. Yeah, it said. You do. It turned and looked at her directly. That is, I think, the most remarkable thing about your species. Not the wars, not the strategies, not the things you built to fight with. It is that every time you fell, and you fell many, many times, you stood up again and tried clear's throat to build something better than what was there before. Vasquez said nothing. She just looked at the stars. They were very old, those stars. They had been burning long before humanity existed, and they would burn long after everything anyone in that corridor had ever known was gone. But for right now, in this moment, a small species from a small blue world at the edge of an unremarkable galaxy was standing in the middle of the greatest structure ever built by living minds, having just helped save the lives of species it had only known for 3 years, carrying 10,000 years of hard lessons in its bones. Akeper appeared at the far end of the corridor and walked toward her. He had clearly not slept in 2 days. His jacket was rumpled, and there was a data pad tucked under his arm that he had probably been clutching for hours. It's over, he said. It's over, she said. He stood there for a second, processing that. Then he let out a long, slow breath and leaned against the corridor wall. What do we do now? He asked. She looked at him. Then she looked back out at the stars, at the vast, old, endless dark, full of worlds and species and problems she hadn't encountered yet, and questions she hadn't thought to ask, and crises she couldn't predict, and all the enormous, complicated, extraordinary work of being part of something larger than yourself. We stay, she said. We show up. We do the work. She turned and started walking, same as always. He pushed off the wall and fell in step beside her. Behind them, the stars continued their slow, ancient burning, indifferent and magnificent, and full of everything that was still, too.